Every map has a story, but some maps were drawn by people who never set foot on the land, and the people who actually lived there, well, they had to fight just to exist in it. And today we're about to hear the story of one of those places. Somewhere around 400 BC, Bantu-speaking peoples from West Central Africa began moving eastward and southward across the continent. You might think that's because they were wandering without any direction in mind. But you'd be wrong, because in reality they were expanding, and they brought with them something that fundamentally changed the landscape. 2 words: iron technology. Here's how that works. Iron tools meant better farming. Better farming meant more food. More food meant more people. More people meant they needed more land. So they did what they had to do and kept moving. They moved into the fertile river valleys, down toward the coast and into what we now call Mozambique. That's essentially their origin story, but it gets better. See, by around 1000 AD, something was happening. Trade winds across the Indian Ocean had been connecting this coastline with Arabia, India, and Persia for centuries, which meant gold, ivory, and copper were moving out, and beads, cloth, and ceramics were moving in. But it wasn't just goods that these nations were exchanging, because where there is trade, there's usually culture. So let me give you the rundown of what happened. Arab and Swahili merchants settled along the coast. Port towns flourished. Islam spread. And a whole cosmopolitan world emerged along this thin strip of coastline. All before anyone in Europe had even thought to sail this far south. But as we know, it wouldn't take that long for the Europeans to enter the picture. Because by 1498, we meet a Portuguese explorer named Vasco da Gama. At the time, he rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed into the Indian Ocean. And within a few years, the Portuguese had seized the island of Mozambique and the port of Sofala. By the 1530s, they were pushing inland, setting up garrisons along the Zambezi River, trying to choke off the gold trade for themselves. On top of that, they were able to grab the coastal trade from the Arab merchants, and they built forts, extracted resources. Plus, they created a system of land grants called prazush that essentially turned huge tracts of land and people into private property. So yes, you could say it more or less worked for almost 200 years. But by 1698, Arab forces had retaken the key Portuguese stronghold at Mombasa. Omani and Mazri Arabs pushed back into the Indian Ocean trade, and eventually the Portuguese were forced to retreat south. For a while there, it looked like the whole project might collapse. It didn't though. Instead, it only got worse. For Mozambique. Here's why. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, Mozambique became one of the main arteries of the East African slave trade, meaning Mozambicans were sold into the Portuguese and Brazilian trade, the Arab trade from the Swahili coast, and the French trade to sugar islands in the Indian Ocean. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of lives here that had to be rerouted, and entire communities basically being hollowed out. Then came the scramble for Africa. European powers were sitting around a table in Berlin in 1884. They carved up a continent they'd mostly never set foot in, and basically planned out the invasion, partition, and colonization of Africa. Portugal walked away with Mozambique, though their control over it was generous, as some might argue, because even though the country was technically under Portuguese rule, much of the land was still ruled by local chiefs and kingdoms, who had no intention of bowing to Lisbon. So Portugal did what colonial powers do when they can't afford to govern something themselves. They handed it to private companies. And it worked. Chartered companies like the Mozambique Company moved in, built railways, opened mines and sugar plantations. But the thing is, all of these happened on the backs of Africans forced into labour. Naturally, all the profits went to Lisbon and to shareholders, leaving Mozambicans with nothing. As you'd expect, tensions were on the rise and Mozambicans were bound to reach their breaking point, one way or the other. That eventually happened in 1960. In the northern town of Mueda, a group of Mozambicans peacefully gathered to demand independence. Portuguese troops opened fire, and the message was received loud and clear. Independence was out of the picture. 2 years later, in 1962, Mozambican exiles meeting in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, founded Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front. Led by Eduardo Mondlane, they launched an armed guerrilla campaign in 1964. Of course, the Portuguese didn't just sit back and wait. No, they responded with tens of thousands of troops. In the end, Mondlane was assassinated in 1969, but Samora took over and kept pushing. Meanwhile, back in Lisbon, Portugal's own people were getting tired of the war, tired of the dictatorship, tired of the whole thing. So, in 1974, the Portuguese military staged a coup against their own government, which then forced the new government to rethink their control over their lands, including Mozambique. And on June 25th, 1975, Mozambique became independent, after centuries of trade empires, colonial rule, forced labour, and armed resistance. It was finally officially its own country. Cue the celebration. Right? Wrong. Because this is where our story takes a turn. See, when independence came, there was no stability yet. Frelimo set up a one-party Marxist state, complete with collective farms, nationalised land, and loyalty to the Soviet bloc. Farmers who had fought for the right to own their land found themselves being herded into communal villages instead. That's not exactly what they signed up for. And the neighbours, well, they were watching very, very closely. Specifically, Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. They didn't want a Marxist state on their border, especially one that was openly sheltering liberation movements fighting against them. So they consolidated a plan. They built Renamo. They funded it, armed it, pointed it at Frelimo, and let it loose. What followed was 17 years of civil war. Along with it, there were burned villages, displaced families, destroyed schools, and hospitals. Over 1 million people dead, and millions more were fleeing the borders. By the mid-1980s, Frelimo had basically lost control of huge swaths of the country. They were exhausted, to say the least. Renamo was exhausted. Everyone was exhausted. So in 1992, Frelimo and Renamo signed a UN-brokered peace agreement. 2 years later, the country held its first ever multi-party elections. Frelimo won, but not by a landslide, and for the first time in a very, very long time. The guns went quiet, but if you're like me, you're probably sitting there and wondering, after all that, the civil wars, the colonization, the famine, how did the land stay intact? Well, that's what we're about to find out next. So, remember how I said that across centuries, people kept arriving in Mozambique and refusing to leave? Yes, I'm talking about the Arabs, the Portuguese, the traders, basically everyone. Well, now I understand why. Because have you seen the place? Mozambique sits on the southeastern coast of Africa, facing the Indian Ocean, with a coastline that runs from the Ruvuma River in the north, all the way down to Ponta do Ouro in the south. To put that into perspective, that's like the driving distance from New York to Miami. Twice. But this time around, all you're seeing is the beach. But don't think that's all Mozambique is. Because it's actually got two personalities. North of the Zambezi, that's where you'll find narrow coastal plains that give way to hills, then plateaus, then rugged highlands. And one of the special features of this place is called Mount Benga. It's the country's highest peak that it shares with Zimbabwe. So that's the first personality. The second one is in the south of the Zambezi. This is where the land opens up to wider lowlands, flatter plains, and of course, I can't forget about the Libumbu Mountains framing the far south like a natural border wall. But let's go back to the coast itself, because that deserves a spotlight. It's lined with mangroves, shallow reefs, and some of the most pristine diving spots on the continent. On top of those here, you'll find 3 island archipelagos, the Kirimbash in the north, the Primeirash and Segundash in the middle, and the Baza Hrutu archipelago further south. Sounds pretty exciting, right? That's why I linked all your travel essentials in the description below. I'm giving you flight and accommodation deals, a custom trip planner, and just so you can stay connected wherever you are, a travel-safe VPN. Now, you're ready to explore. But before that, it's important you know the climate, and in Mozambique it basically runs on 2 seasons, wet from October to March, and dry from April to September. In terms of wildlife, well, there are over 200 species of mammals here, and 740 species of birds. And the Big Five, they roam national parks. If you're not familiar with what they are, the Big Five consists of the African elephant, African leopard, Cape buffalo, black rhino, and of course the African lion. Among these, the African elephant is considered Mozambique's national animal. But that's not even the most exciting news, because did you know that underneath all of the soil and seabed, there are coal, gold, gemstones, marbles, and some of the largest offshore natural gas reserves ever discovered in sub-Saharan Africa. That's why everyone wanted it so bad. The land was always the price. which raises an obvious question. If Mozambique sits on such rich biodiversity and natural resources, why is it still one of the poorest countries in the world? The short answer is this: history set the table, and the decades after independence knocked everything off it. See, after the Civil War ended in 1992, Mozambique was essentially starting from zero, because at that point, all it had was burned infrastructure, shattered institutions, and a workforce that had spent 17 years surviving. So naturally, the country had to rebuild everything from the ground up, with borrowed money and international aid holding the whole thing together. And for a while, sure, it worked. In fact, through the 2000s and early 2010s, Mozambique posted some of the highest GDP growth rates in the world, regularly hitting 7 or 8% a year. When investors heard that, they flocked to the country. Gas fields were discovered offshore, and the future for once looked bright. Then 2016 happened. There was a hidden debt scandal that came to light. Apparently there was $2 billion in secret government funds, and the IMF pulled its support. Foreign aid dried up. Mozambique eventually entered what the World Bank would later call the lost decade. By 2022, nearly 20 million Mozambicans, out of a population of about 35 million, were living in poverty. From 2015 to 2020, urban poverty jumped from 32% to 44%, and rural poverty hit a high 71%, which means the majority of the people were suffering. Then came disputed elections in October 2024. There were violent protests and destroyed businesses. Things were falling apart. Of course, the experts had something to say about that. Oxford Economics forecast just 0.3% growth for 2026. The World Bank, in a bluntly worded March 2026 report, used the phrase debt distress and warned that economic stability could threaten over $50 billion in foreign investment. That includes the massive offshore LNG projects that were supposed to be Mozambique's ticket out. But the story's not over yet, because if you remember, gas is still there. A graphite processing plant just opened in Niassa province. So the new president, Daniel Shapu, is pushing for national unity and signalling a reform agenda. Now, the Mozambique LNG project in the Rovuma Basin is back on the table, after security conditions in the north improved. Knowing this, the World Bank puts it plainly. The window for action is narrowing, but it hasn't closed. As of right now, Mozambique has everything it needs to turn this around. What it's still working on is the will, the stability, and the time. But rest assured, through everything we've talked about, the people are still here, and they're still dancing. Which brings us to the last thing you need to know about Mozambique. And honestly, it's my favourite part. Would you believe me if I told you that Mozambique has over 1,000 traditional dances? Or that in the Bantu languages of the south, the word ngoma can mean music, dance, drum, or song? That's because to Mozambicans, they were never really separate things. To them, it's all just one big expression. An expression that throughout history, people have tried to reshape and stop in one way or another. Like the Portuguese, who banned certain rituals. Or the Frelimu government after independence, which declared traditional practices like initiation rites, spiritual healing, and lineage customs incomparable with scientific socialism. Well, whatever they did, it didn't completely work, because the dances are still here. And it's not just dance. For instance, Benta, the country's most iconic music style, was literally invented as a form of resistance. Born in the 1950s and played on homemade guitars, built from oil cans and fishing line called viola de lata, its lyrics quietly mocked colonial rule in ways the censors couldn't quite pin down. Yes, protest music was disguised as a party, and the same is true for food. Cassava and cornmeal porridge from the Bantu heartland, piri piri from the Arab spice routes, rice pilaf from Indian traders, coffee shops from the Portuguese. Every plate is a summary of everyone who ever passed through, because you know what they say. If you can't beat 'em, join 'em. So the Mozambicans didn't resist it. They absorbed it into their cuisine, seasoned it to perfection, and made it their very own. And guess what? This is actually the deeper meaning behind this video. You see, Mozambique was never just a passive stage for other people's ambitions. Yes, they've been influenced by the outside world time and time again, but they wove it into something distinctly its own. And that's what makes Mozambique culture what it is today. So, what did you think of our story? Wasn't it quite enlightening? I'd love to hear what you thought of it in the comments below. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you'll love this next one.